Umarsa, 4th of December 1864, Ackworth, West Yorkshire. John Fowler is 38 years old. He is lying in a farmhouse bedroom with a broken arm, a fever, and a jaw he can no longer open. 4 years ago, he stood on 9 acres of Leeds clay and declared that steam would free the human body from the tyranny of the soil. He died of tetanus, contracted from a fall, on a fox hunt. He never saw what came next. Within 20 years, his machines were turning earth on 5 continents. Egyptian cotton fields, Brazilian sugar plantations, the grazing lands of colonial Queensland. By 1913, his factory employed 3,000 men across 14 acres. It would go on to build Churchill tanks for a world war. It would outlast him by 110 years. Then in the early weeks of 1974, with no ceremony and no speech, the gates at Hunslet closed for the last time. Today, a supermarket car park occupies the ground. One blue plaque remains. The question this film asks is not how a factory dies. It is what happens when the ideals that built it are tested and found wanting, long before the end. John Fowler was not supposed to end up in a field. He was born on the 11th of July, 1826 in Melksham, Wiltshire, to a family of prosperous Quakers whose instincts ran toward commerce, conscience, and the careful management of both. His father was a merchant. His community was built on the belief that no man stood between another man and God, and by extension, that no man had the right to grind another into dust for profit. It was not a fashionable position in an England growing fat on exactly that arrangement, but the Fowlers held it, quietly and completely, in the way that Quakers tend to hold things. Fowler trained as an engineer in his early 20s at the ironworks of Gilkes, Wilson and Company in Middlesbrough. He was precise, restless, and constitutionally incapable of observing a problem without attempting to solve it. The problem he observed, the one that would consume the next 14 years of his life, was not mechanical. It was human. In the winter fields of mid-century England, men and horses were doing work that was killing them both. Plowing heavy clay soil was an act of endurance that bordered on punishment. A good team could turn an acre a day in favorable conditions. In wet or compacted ground, that figure collapsed. Drainage was worse. The mole plow, dragged through waterlogged earth to create underground channels, required so much animal and human force that it remained, in practical terms, inaccessible to the farmers who needed it most. The land was holding people hostage. Fowler decided that steam would pay the ransom. His first experiments began in 1850 in Bristol in partnership with fellow Quaker Albert Fry. Of the chocolate-making family, a detail history has always found quietly amusing. Together they developed a steam-powered drainage plow and exhibited it at the Royal Agricultural Society's show in Exeter that year. The machine worked. The reception was polite and largely baffled. Fowler was undeterred. He refined, rebuilt, and returned. By 1854, he was at the Royal Agricultural Society's Lincoln meeting with an 8-horsepower portable steam engine supplied by Clayton and Shuttleworth. The complete equipment cost £500. The cost of drainage using his machine came to 35 shillings per acre, a figure that represented a genuine and calculable liberation for tenant farmers carrying debt in wet counties. He was awarded a Silver Star. He went home and immediately began improving the design. What distinguished Fowler from his contemporaries was not merely mechanical ingenuity. Several men were working on steam cultivation in this period, but a specific understanding of economics as a moral instrument. In 1851, he had looked at the price of his own drainage machine and found it wanting. £150 was too much for the average farmer. He restructured his business model to reduce costs by 35 to 65% and introduced a hiring scheme payable by the day or by the month, so that ownership was never the barrier to access. He was designing for inclusion. He simply called it fair dealing. The decisive moment came in 1858. The Royal Agricultural Society of England had offered a prize of £500 for the best practical application of steam power to agricultural land. Fowler entered. His competitors were formidable. Thomas Ricketts' rotary cultivator, Charles Burrell's direct traction plow, William Smith's roundabout system. The trials were rigorous and the scrutiny was public. The judges were unambiguous in their verdict. Fowler's machine, they wrote, could turn over the soil efficiently at a demonstrable saving compared with horse labor, and left the land in a far more desirable condition for husbandry. The prize was his, £500, the same sum his equipment had cost 4 years earlier in Lincoln. The symmetry was accidental, but Fowler, who believed in the moral geometry of things, might have noticed it. He was 32 years old. He had proven that steam could plow. What he had not yet proven was that he could build a factory capable of delivering that proof to the world at scale. That problem would take him north, to Leeds, to 9 acres of leased ground on Lethley Lane, and to a partnership that would outlast him by more than a century. He had 8 years left. In the early weeks of 1860, John Fowler acquired a lease on 727 square yards of land on Lethley Lane in Hunslet, Leeds, a district that already smelled of iron, coal smoke, and ambition. The ground had previously belonged to a Spanish leather works. It was not a romantic beginning, but Fowler had not come to Leeds for romance. He had come because Leeds was where engines were made. His arrangement with the locomotive builders Kitson, Thompson, and Hewitson had served its purpose. They had manufactured his plows while his own capacity was limited. But Fowler understood that an inventor who depends on another man's factory is always one disagreement away from disaster. The steam plow works, as he named it from the first day, would be his own. He took on Robert William Edison as a financial partner and began building. By the end of 1860, approximately 100 men were employed on the site. The following year, at a Leeds trial of steam cultivation, a Fowler machine of 12 horsepower plowed and scarified 4 acres in 4 hours. The watching farmers did not applaud politely. They calculated. It was 1861 and the steam plow works was still finding its feet when a young German engineer named Max Eith arrived at the gates and asked to speak with Mr. Fowler. Eith was 25 years old, trained in Stuttgart, and possessed of a quality that Fowler immediately recognized as useful. He could translate not just between languages, but between worlds. He understood machines with the precision of an engineer and people with the instincts of a diplomat. In his later memoir, he recorded the first time he saw Fowler, standing in the middle of a circle of farmers who had just watched a steam plow turn a field, their faces flushed with something between astonishment and avarice. Fowler stood at the center of that circle and answered every question with the same calm fluency. Eith watched and understood at once that this was not merely a factory. It was a movement. He was hired. The partnership between Fowler and Eith, the Wiltshire Quaker and the Lutheran from Württemberg, was one of those improbable conjunctions that industrial history occasionally produces and rarely explains. Fowler provided the moral architecture, the conviction that the machine existed to serve the man, not the reverse. Eith provided the range, the languages, the cultural dexterity, the appetite for travel that would eventually carry Fowler's machines into fields that Fowler himself would never see. Egypt, Turkey, Russia, the sugar estates of Queensland. Wherever the soil was heavy and the labor expensive, Eith went first and opened the door. In 1862, Fowler formalized his Leeds operation by entering into partnership with William Watson Hewitson, founding the firm of Hewitson and Fowler. The arrangement lasted precisely 1 year. Hewitson died in May 1863, leaving Fowler to continue alone, now trading under the name John Fowler and Company. His brother Robert ran the London office on Cornhill. David Greig, methodical, quietly formidable, was beginning to move into the inner circle of management. By 1863, the workforce had grown from 100 to 400. In 3 years, Fowler had built not merely a factory, but a functioning organism, one capable of absorbing loss, adapting to change, and continuing to expand even as its founder's health began, quietly and without announcement, to fail. By the summer of 1864, John Fowler was exhausted in a way that sleep could not touch. He had spent 14 years in a state of sustained, almost compulsive effort, experimenting, rebuilding, exhibiting, negotiating, managing, expanding. He had built a factory from 9 acres of leather works, ground into an operation employing hundreds of men. He had won the prize that defined his field. He had placed his machines in the hands of farmers across England and the edges of a global empire. He had done all of this while maintaining the discipline of conscience. The hiring schemes, the cost reductions, the insistence that the technology serve those who needed it most. The body keeps its own accounts. By mid-1864, Fowler's were overdrawn. His doctors advised rest. He retired to Ackworth, a quiet village in the West Riding, to recuperate. Friends suggested that gentle exercise might restore him. Fresh air, moderate activity, the countryside. Someone suggested hunting. On a crisp autumn morning, John Fowler went out with the hunt. His horse stumbled. He fell. The fracture to his arm was compound, the bone breaking through the skin. And in 1864, a compound fracture carried risks that no amount of medical attention could reliably neutralize. Tetanus set in during his recovery. On the 4th of December, 1864, John Fowler died at Ackworth. He was 38 years old. The factory did not pause. This is perhaps the most revealing detail in the entire history of the steam plough works. Not the death itself, which was sudden and senseless and cruel in the way that only arbitrary accidents can be, but the fact that the institution he had built was already sufficiently robust to absorb his absence without breaking stride. His will had anticipated everything. Robert Fowler, his brother, assumed control of the firm alongside Robert Edison. The terms were careful, the transition orderly. Gregg stepped forward. The drawings office continued to produce. The furnaces continued to burn. Ith, writing later about those weeks, described the atmosphere at the works as one of determined quietness. Grief held in suspension while the work went on, because the work was what Fowler had left behind, and to stop it would have been, in some sense, to lose him twice. There is a particular kind of institution that carries its founder's character so completely into its DNA that it continues to express that character long after the founder's gone. The steam plough works was that kind of institution. Fowler had built it to be useful, rigorous, and relentless. It would remain all three things for another 110 years. What it could not carry forward, what died with him in that farmhouse bedroom in Ackworth, was the living conscience at the center of the enterprise. The man who had designed a higher scheme so that poor farmers could access the technology. The man who had calculated cost per acre with the moral precision of someone who understood that price is a form of politics. The machines would go on. They would cross oceans and enter continents. They would plow fields in Egypt and cut furrows through the red soil of Queensland. They would be ordered in their hundreds by men who had never met a Quaker and had no interest in becoming one. The question of whose fields they would plow and under what conditions would from this point forward be answered by other men entirely. Max Eighth understood this. He did not say so directly, but in the years after Fowler's death, as he traveled further and further from Leeds on behalf of the company, he began to keep a different kind of notebook. Not the engineer's log of tolerances and tensile strengths, but something closer to a novelist's journal. Observations about people, places, and the strange moral geography of a world being remade by machines. He was taking notes for a reckoning that was still decades away. The men who inherited John Fowler's factory did not inherit his ideology. They inherited something more immediately useful, his order book. Robert Fowler was a capable administrator with none of his brother's missionary fervor and all of his brother's commercial discipline. Robert Edison was a financier who understood leverage. David Gregg, who now assumed day-to-day management of the works with a quiet authority that would define the next quarter century, was something rarer still. A man who could hold the technical and the commercial in his mind simultaneously without allowing either to crowd out the other. Together, the three of them looked at what John Fowler had built and made a decision that would determine the character of the steam plough works for the next 20 years. They decided to sell it to the world. The logic was straightforward. Britain's agricultural land was finite. Its farmers were, by the 1860s, already familiar with steam cultivation. The market was growing, but it was not unlimited. The rest of the world, however, was another proposition entirely. The plantations of Brazil, the cotton estates of Egypt, the vast grazing territories of colonial Australia, the sugar fields of Germany, France, and the overseas empires of both. Wherever the soil was worked at scale, Wherever labor costs were rising or supply was uncertain, a Fowler engine represented not merely a machine, but a solution to an economic equation that plantation owners and colonial administrators understood with great clarity. Gregg understood it with equal clarity. He began to push the export operation with systematic energy. Max Eighth was his instrument. Through the late 1860s and into the 1870s, Eighth traveled on behalf of the company with a stamina and range that bordered on the extraordinary. Egypt, Turkey, Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire, the coastal estates of South America. He did not merely sell engines. He demonstrated them, repaired them in the field, trained local operators, and wrote back to Leeds with detailed reports on soil conditions, crop types, and the specific mechanical requirements of each territory. He was, in effect, the company's global intelligence network, a one-man research department operating across continents simultaneously. The orders followed him like a tide. By the early 1870s, Fowler engines were working on sugar plantations in Queensland, where the Decauville Portable Railway System, a network of lightweight, movable track panels licensed from the French inventor Paul de Decauville, was being adapted and extended by the Leeds works to carry harvested cane from field to mill. The relationship with Decauville was a commercial arrangement dressed in the language of mutual benefit. Fowler had supplied Decauville with steam plows for his own sugar beet plantation in France. Decauville had produced Fowler implements under license in return. By 1879, Fowler had introduced their own variant, Grieg's patent portable railway, a development that somewhat soured the partnership but significantly expanded the company's product range and its penetration of the colonial agricultural market. The factory at Hunslet grew to meet the demand. New workshops were added. The foundry expanded. The drawing office, where Gregg's engineers worked through the night on modifications for soil types that none of them had ever stood on, became one of the most productive technical departments in the West Riding. By 1876, Fowler was exhibiting at the Royal Agricultural Show in Birmingham with engines ranging from 6 to 14 horsepower, finished in a new very dark green that became the company's visual signature, the color of money and of growing things, rendered in iron. The same year, members of the Iron and Steel Institute visited the works. What they found was not the modest operation that John Fowler had opened 16 years earlier, but a complex industrial organism occupying 9 acres, bordered on one side by Kitson and Company and on the other by Shepherd and Hill, an entire neighborhood given over to the manufacture of machines that were changing the agricultural geography of the planet. By 1881, the workforce stood at 1,100. The site had become a self-contained industrial district. And then, in December of that year, something happened that tested whether the institution Gregg had built was truly robust or merely fortunate. Fire tore through the works. The damage was catastrophic. And the answer to that question came in the hours immediately after. Not in words, but in the speed of what Gregg did next. In 1886, John Fowler and Company, Leeds Limited, was formally registered. It was, by any measure, an empire. Max Eighth left Leeds for the last time in the mid-1880s. He went back to Germany, where he would eventually write a series of novels and stories drawn from his years in the field. Quietly celebrated works that captured, with the precision of an engineer and the sadness of a witness, the human texture of a world being remade by machines. He prospered. He was the one who got out. The notebooks he had kept in those distant fields have not survived. But the look in the eyes of the engineers in his fiction, dropped into foreign territories with a machine and a manual and an instruction to make it work, was described consistently by his readers as troubled. He had seen things in those fields. He had written them down. Whether he made peace with what he had seen is a question the record does not answer. There is a photograph in the archives of the Museum of English Rural Life in Reading. It shows a Fowler ploughing engine standing at the edge of a field that is not in England. The soil is red. The horizon is flat and enormous. The men standing beside the machine are small in the frame, and they are not the men who built it. Nobody recorded their names. This is where the story of John Fowler and Company becomes uncomfortable. Not because the company did something that was unusual for its time, but precisely because it did not. What happened to Fowler's machines after they left the yard at Hunslet was entirely ordinary. That is the point. That is the problem. By the 1870s, the largest single market for Fowler plowing engines was not British agriculture. It was the colonial plantation economy, the vast, brutal, and extraordinarily profitable system of large-scale cultivation that stretched from the sugar estates of Queensland and Cuba to the cotton fields of Egypt, the coffee fazendas of Brazil, and the sisal and tobacco plantations of British East Africa. These were enterprises built on the organized exploitation of human labor, indentured workers, contract laborers, men and women whose legal freedom had been nominally restored by Emancipation Acts and colonial reforms, but whose practical freedom remained, in the fields at least, theoretical. The plantation owners had a straightforward problem. Labor was expensive or unreliable, or both. The margins on sugar and cotton depended on volume, and volume depended on turning the maximum possible acreage in the minimum possible time. A Fowler double-engine set, two machines working in concert, hauling a multi-furrow balance plow back and forth across a field on a steel cable, could do in a day what 50 men with horses could not accomplish in a week. The arithmetic was simple. The orders arrived at Hunsleigh in a steady stream throughout the 1870s and 1880s, routed through agents in Liverpool, Hamburg, and Antwerp, and the engines were built, tested, crated, and shipped. Nobody at Leeds asked what they would be used for. The question was not considered relevant to the transaction. This requires a moment of stillness because it sits in direct contradiction to everything John Fowler believed he was building. He had constructed his hiring scheme so that poor farmers could access technology they could not afford to own. He had calculated his cost per acre figures with the explicit intention of making steam cultivation available below the threshold of debt. He had designed, in other words, for the relief of agricultural labor, for the proposition that the machine should carry the burden that the body could not sustain without damage. His machines were now carrying that burden on behalf of men who had invested in plantations, precisely because the labor on those plantations was cheap enough to be expendable. The distinction between a Fowler engine serving a Yorkshire tenant farmer and a Fowler engine serving a Queensland sugar estate was not visible in the ledger. Both registered as sales. Both contributed to the order books that Gregg reviewed each morning, the accounts that Edison balanced each quarter, the production figures that justified expanding the foundry and hiring another 100 men at Hunslet. The machine was neutral. The machine did what it was told. The machine, as machines always do, served whoever held the controls. What made this particularly acute in Fowler's case was the Quaker inheritance, the specific moral architecture that had shaped the company's founding logic. The Society of Friends had been among the earliest and most consistent institutional opponents of the slave trade in Britain. Quaker merchants in the late 18th century had refused to handle slave-produced goods. Quaker businessmen had, in several documented cases, restructured their commercial operations at considerable personal cost to avoid complicity in the plantation economy. This was not a peripheral position within the tradition that produced John Fowler. It was central to it. Fowler himself had died in 1864. He cannot be held accountable for decisions made in the 1870s and 1880s. But the men who ran his company in those decades had inherited not merely his factory, but his name. And with that name, an implicit claim to a certain kind of moral seriousness. Whether they examined that claim, whether they held it up against the shipping manifest and found it wanting, the historical record does not say. The record shows only the engines, hundreds of them. Dispatched to territories whose conditions Fowler, had he lived, might have found irreconcilable with the purpose for which he had built the machine in the first place. Max Eighth had seen those territories. He had stood in those fields. He had watched the engines work and said nothing publicly for the rest of his career. Perhaps he had concluded that the machine was not the problem. Perhaps he had concluded that the problem was too large for a notebook entry to address. Perhaps he had simply looked at the arithmetic, at the orders and the employment and the thousands of families in Hunslet whose rent and bread depended on the continuity of production, and decided that the only honest response to an impossible question was silence. It is, in any case, the question that the steam plough works never formally asked itself. Not in the 1870s, Not in the 1880s. Not at any point in the 110 years of its operation did the company convene a meeting to examine the end use of the machines it manufactured, or the conditions under which they were deployed, or the relationship between its founding ideals and the colonial economy it was, quarter by quarter, helping to mechanize. The engines went out, the money came in, the foundry expanded, the furnaces burned, and somewhere in a red-soiled field on the far side of the world, a Fowler plowing engine turned the earth with a precision and a power that its maker had intended as a gift, to men whose names the archives do not record, in the service of men whose names the company never needed to know. It began, as these things often do, without warning. December in Hunslet was already a month of iron cold and compressed darkness, the kind of Leeds winter that settled into the bones of the district and stayed there until March. The streets around Lethley Lane smelled of coal smoke and wet stone. The works ran on shortened daylight and extended lamplight, the furnaces providing the only warmth that mattered in a building that had never been designed for comfort, only for production. The fire started in the evening. Within hours, it had moved through workshops that had taken 2 decades to build and equip, consuming timber, tooling, stock, and finished engines with the same indiscriminate appetite. By the time it was brought under control, the damage was catastrophic. 1,500 men, the full complement of the works and the surrounding supply trades that depended on it, were thrown out of employment on a December night with no wages forthcoming and no timetable for return. For a company that had spent 20 years projecting an image of absolute industrial permanence, it was a crisis of a kind that no order book could absorb. David Gregg did not sleep that night. There is no dramatic account of what he did instead, no speech recorded, no letter preserved from the hours immediately following the fire. But the decisions that emerged from those hours were so swift and so precise that they could only have been the product of a mind that had already, somewhere in its private recesses, anticipated catastrophe and prepared for it. By the following morning, Gregg had a plan. By the end of the week, it was in motion. The works would be rebuilt, not restored, rebuilt. The difference mattered to Gregg in a way that was both practical and psychological. Restoration implied returning to what had existed before the fire. Rebuilding meant starting from the current state of engineering knowledge and constructing something better. The fire had destroyed 20 years of accumulated workshop infrastructure. It had also, in doing so, cleared the ground for 20 years of accumulated improvement to be incorporated into what came next. It was the kind of reasoning that separates institutions from enterprises. An enterprise calculates the cost of rebuilding and weighs it against the alternative. An institution does not consider the alternative, because the alternative, closure, dispersal, the end of the thing, is not a category of thought that its management entertains. Gregg was the kind of man for whom closure was simply not available as an option. The works existed. It would continue to exist. The question was only how quickly it could be made to function again. The answer, it turned out, was quickly enough. The reconstruction proceeded through the winter and into 1882 with a pace that astonished observers and exhausted the men who drove it. New workshops rose on the footprint of the old ones, built to modern specifications and laid out with greater efficiency than the piecemeal expansion of the previous 2 decades had allowed. New machinery was ordered. The 9-acre site was not merely repaired, it was reorganized. By the time the works reopened at full capacity, those who knew the old buildings found the new ones subtly but meaningfully different, cleaner in their logic, more deliberate in their arrangement, the product of minds that had been forced by catastrophe to think about the factory not as it had accumulated over time, but as it ought rationally to be. There was beneath this practical achievement something worth noticing about the relationship between the company and the community that surrounded it. Hunslet in 1881 was not a neighborhood in the modern sense, a collection of individuals who happened to occupy the same postal district. It was an organism, and the steam plough works was its central organ. The 1,500 men affected by the fire were not simply employees. They were fathers, sons, brothers, lodgers in houses whose rent was calibrated to a Fowler wage. Their wives ran households whose weekly arithmetic depended on the envelope that arrived on Friday. Their children attended schools that existed in part because the district could sustain them. When the works burned, The damage radiated outward through every street within half a mile of Lethley Lane, not as smoke or structural damage, but as the specific, grinding anxiety of people who understood, without needing to be told, that their lives were organized around a single point of vulnerability. Gregg understood this. It is not certain that he articulated it in those terms. The language of industrial paternalism in 1881 had its own conventions and its own limitations. But the speed of his response suggests a man who felt the weight of that dependency not as an abstraction, but as a personal obligation. The works reopened. The men returned. The engines began rolling off the yard again, destined for orders that had waited patiently through the interruption. And David Gregg, who had held the institution together through its worst night and driven its reconstruction with a will that left no room for doubt or delay, went back to his desk and continued the work. He had perhaps a decade left. He would not waste a day of it. David Gregg died in 1891. He died at his home in Headingley Hill, aged 63, having spent the better part of 3 decades holding the steam plough works together through the death of its founder. The departure of its most gifted engineer, a catastrophic fire, and the relentless commercial pressure of an industry that was beginning, at the edges, to change in ways that nobody at Lethley Lane had yet fully reckoned with. He was described in his obituary as a man of considerable ability and sound judgment. The kind of language that the Victorian press reserved for men who had done essential things without making a noise about it, whose contribution was structural rather than spectacular, whose absence would be felt long before it was fully understood. He did not live to see what the company became. In 1913, John Fowler and Company, Leeds Limited, published a catalog that opened with a statement of such serene self-confidence that it reads, "Across a century less like advertising copy than like a geological survey of an established fact. The manufacture of road locomotives, traction engines, tractors, steam plowing engines, and road rollers," it announced, had commenced at the steam plough works about the year 1850, and the modern engines were the outcome of accumulated experience gained since then. The works covered an area of over 14 acres. Between 2,800 and 3,000 men and boys were employed almost exclusively in the manufacture of various types of steam and oil engine and implements. Proof, the catalog added, of the constantly increasing demand. 14 acres, 3,000 men. From 727 square yards of leased leather works aground in 1860, the steam plough works had grown into one of the largest and most diversified engineering operations in the north of England. The product range by 1913 was extraordinary in its breadth. Steam ploughing engines, road rollers, traction engines, compound agricultural engines, portable engines, narrow-gauge railway locomotives for plantation railways, portable track panels, wagons, and an expanding line of oil-powered machines that signaled, without quite admitting it, that the age of steam was approaching its long, slow afternoon. The narrow-gauge locomotive business illustrates something important about how the company had evolved since Gregg's death. Fowler had always supplied engines to overseas plantations. That history, with all its complexity, ran back to the 1870s. But in the decades around the turn of the century, the company had developed a secondary specialism in complete plantation railway systems. The engines, the track, the rolling stock, the entire infrastructure of a field-to-mill transport network, designed, manufactured, and delivered as a single integrated solution. Queensland sugar, Brazilian coffee, the sisal estates of German East Africa, the tea gardens of Ceylon. Fowler's narrow-gauge locomotives worked in conditions that bore no relation to the west-riding winters in which they were assembled. Hauling cane through tropical heat, navigating gradients that would have stopped a mainline engine, running on track that was laid and relayed by hand as the harvest moved across the field. At Hunslet, what was visible was the scale. The foundry ran through the night on peak production weeks. The drawing office produced designs for markets as far apart as Argentina and Fiji, modifying tolerances and specifications for soil types and fuel supplies that varied enormously between territories. The yard where finished engines stood in rows awaiting dispatch was by some accounts the most impressive single site in Hunslet on a clear morning. 3,000 men walked through the gates each morning. They came from Hunslet and Holbeck, from Beston and Armley, from streets whose houses had been built in the 1860s and 1870s specifically to accommodate a workforce that the factory had called into existence. Many of them were second-generation Fowler men, sons of fathers who had rebuilt the works after the 1881 fire, grandsons of men who had watched the first engines roll off the yard when Leeds was still learning what it was going to become. The company was not merely an employer in the modern sense. It was a form of civic infrastructure, a structuring principle around which an entire district had organized its domestic and social life over the course of half a century. The war was 13 months away, and the steam plough works, employing more men, producing more machinery, and reaching more markets than at any previous point in its history, was about to discover, as every engineering works in England was about to discover, that scale is not the same thing as immunity. The years between 1914 and 1918 transformed the steam plough works, as they transformed every engineering works in Britain, into something the men who had built it would barely have recognized. The factory that had spent half a century perfecting the mechanics of turning soil now turned its capacity to military production. Shell components, mechanical equipment, ancillary engineering work. The drawing office that had designed plows for Egyptian cotton fields now worked to government specifications, under government timelines, for a customer whose requirements changed with the progress of a war that showed no sign of ending on any schedule that anyone had forecast. The machines kept running. The gates kept opening. The work went on, but the work was different, and the men who did it knew it, in the way that workers always know when the thing they have built their lives around has been repurposed by forces larger than itself. The war ended in November 1918, and the orders stopped almost immediately. This was not unique to Fowler. It was the common experience of every heavy engineering works in Britain that had spent 4 years converting its productive capacity to military supply. The sudden, vertiginous lurch from a guaranteed government customer with unlimited appetite to a civilian market that was exhausted, impoverished, and in no particular hurry to buy agricultural machinery. The transition had no cushion. The order books that had been full on the 10th of November were largely empty by January. The men who had worked double shifts through the war years found themselves on reduced hours, then on no hours, then standing at the gates in the cold with a letter in their breast pocket that said the works regretted. The 1920s at Fowler were a decade of managed contraction, dressed, when possible, in the language of adaptation. The company was not passive. It had understood earlier than most that the internal combustion engine was not a novelty to be waited out, but a structural shift to be embraced or be destroyed by. Through the early 1920s, Fowler began developing its range of diesel and petrol-powered machinery, tractors, road rollers, crawler vehicles, with the same methodical energy that Gregg had once applied to rebuilding after the fire. The Fowler gyrotiller, introduced in 1927, was among the most ambitious machines the company had ever produced. A vast tracked vehicle, 34 feet long and 10 feet 6 inches wide, powered initially by a 225 horsepower Ricardo petrol engine and later by a 170 horsepower MAN diesel. Its rotary tines could penetrate the soil to a depth of 500 millimeters. It could, its makers claimed, convert virgin territory to seedbed in a single pass at the rate of an acre per hour. 88 were built in total. It was not enough. The Great Depression arrived in 1929 and tightened its grip on the heavy engineering industry with a patience and thoroughness that made the post-war slump look, in retrospect, like a brief squall before a sustained storm. Orders collapsed. Export markets contracted as commodity prices fell, and plantation owners deferred capital expenditure with the same reflex that farmers had used in every agricultural depression since the invention of credit. The Leeds engineering district, which had once seemed inexhaustible in its productive density, began to thin. Manning Wardle, the locomotive builders whose works had neighbored Fowler's on Hunslet Lane for decades, closed in 1927. Kitson and Company, the firm whose partnership had given Fowler his first Leeds foothold in 1860, struggled through the early 1930s and collapsed definitively in 1938. The streets around Lethley Lane, which had been built to accommodate the workforce of a booming district, were now accommodating the idleness of a contracting one. At Fowler, the directors did something that the historical record notes without drama, but which represented in human terms a significant act of institutional solidarity. They stopped paying themselves. For a period during the worst years of the Depression, salaries at board level were suspended. It was not a gesture. It was the same calculation that Gregg had made standing in the ruins of the 1881 fire. The institution was worth more than the comfort of the individuals who ran it, and the men at the gates mattered more than the men at the board table. The works survived, but survival extracted its price in permanence. In 1935, production of steam plowing engines ceased at the steam Plough Works, the machine that John Fowler had spent his life inventing, the machine that had given the company its name and its founding purpose, the machine that had turned the soil of field and plantation for the better part of 70 years, was discontinued. Not with ceremony, not with any recorded acknowledgement of what the moment represented. The last order was fulfilled, the last engine completed, and the drawing office moved on to other specifications. 2 years later, in 1937, the final steam-driven vehicle left the yard. It was a road roller, unglamorous, workmanlike, carrying none of the technical ambition of the plowing engines that had made the company's name. It rolled out of the gates at Hunslet on a morning the company's records do not mark as significant. The gates at Leithley Lane had barely absorbed the silence left by the last steamroller when the news from Europe began to change the nature of every conversation about what a factory was for. It was 1937. The war was 2 years away. On the 3rd of September 1939, Britain declared war on Germany, and the question of what a factory was for became, overnight, a question with only one answer. The Churchill tank, designated officially as the Tank Infantry Meeke Reformed, was one of the heaviest and most heavily armored fighting vehicles fielded by the Allied armies in the Second World War. It weighed 40 tons. Its armor plating, at its thickest points, was 4 inches of rolled steel. It was designed not for speed, but for persistence, for climbing gradients that lighter tanks could not manage, for absorbing punishment that would destroy less robust machines, for pushing through terrain and conditions that the military planners of 1941 had correctly identified as the defining features of the European theater of war. It was, in other words, a machine built for the worst possible ground. The men at Hunslet knew something about machines built for the worst possible ground. The conversion of the steam Plough Works to Churchill tank production was not a decision that Fowler's management made freely. In 1941, with the war at its most dangerous pitch and the industrial capacity of the country under a degree of government direction that peacetime would never have permitted, the works was nationalized. The Ministry of Supply assumed control. The drawing office, the foundry, the machine shops, the yard, all of it passed at a stroke from the board of John Fowler and Company, Leeds, limited to the administrative apparatus of a government fighting for national survival. John Fowler had built this factory to free men from physical suffering. The factory that bore his name was now producing 40-ton instruments of armored warfare under government direction for a conflict that would kill 50 million people before it ended. The machines rolling off the yard at Hunslet in 1942 and 1943 were not plowing engines. They were Churchills. The workers who built them, the men of Hunslet and Holbeck and Beeston, many of them sons and grandsons of men who had rebuilt the works after the 1881 fire, did not, so far as any available record suggests, experience this as a contradiction. They were building the best thing they knew how to build, with the skills they had inherited and the materials they were given, for a purpose that required no moral examination, because the alternative to fighting was not peace, but a different and more complete form of destruction. The irony, if it registered at all, registered as the kind of thing you did not say out loud when there was work to be done and a war to be won. The Churchill tanks built at Hunslet served in North Africa, in Italy, and in the grinding campaign across northwest Europe that followed the Normandy landings in June 1944. Several of the specialist variants, the Crocodile flamethrower tank, the AVRE engineering vehicle, were developed from the Churchill chassis and became, in the hands of specialized armored units, among the most tactically significant vehicles of the Western campaign. The basic design, originally criticized for its low speed and conservative engineering, proved its worth in the Italian mountains and the bocage of Normandy, where the terrain vindicated every ton of armor that its designers had specified. The works that had built plowing engines for plantation railways had built something that could climb a cliff face under fire. When the war ended in 1945, the Ministry of Supply found itself in possession of a nationalized engineering works whose productive capacity was no longer required for tank manufacture and whose future ownership had not yet been determined. The resolution, when it came, was swift. The ministry sold the works to Rotary Hose Limited. 2 years later, in 1947, Rotary Hose sold it again to Marshall, Sons and Company Limited of Gainsborough, Lincolnshire, who merged the two operations to form Marshall Fowler Limited. The name survived. The independents did not. The steam plough works, founded on 9 acres of leased ground by a Quaker from Wiltshire who believed that machines should serve men, was now a division of a Lincolnshire agricultural engineering group. Managed from Gainsborough, its future determined by boardrooms that had no particular connection to Lethley Lane, or its history, or the 80 years of accumulated institutional knowledge that the men at the gates carried in their hands and their heads. The gates were still open. The furnaces were still burning. But the thread that ran back to John Fowler, to the hiring schemes and the cost per acre calculations and the moral geometry of a factory founded on principle, had been cut. Not dramatically, not with any single act that could be identified as the moment of severance, just quietly in the way that things end when nobody is quite watching, between one ownership and the next. The last chapter had begun. The decades that followed the Marshall merger were a slow subtraction. Production lines transferred to Gainsborough. Departments reduced. The workforce thinned by the quiet arithmetic of redundancy and early retirement that large industrial groups apply when they have decided, without quite saying so, that a facility has reached the end of its useful life. Through the 1950s and into the 1960s, the works at Hunslet continued to produce rail locomotives, components, specialist engineering work. But the center of gravity had shifted, and the men who came through the gates each morning knew it, in the way that workers always know these things before they are officially told. By the early 1970s, what remained at Lethley Lane was a reduced operation servicing the tail end of contracts that needed to be honored before the books could be closed. The question was no longer whether it would end. The question was when. The winter of 1974 came to Hunslet the way all winters came to Hunslet, low and gray and without apology, settling into the brick and the stone and the cold iron of the district with the patient authority of something that had always been there and intended to remain. The men who walked to work on those January mornings walked the same streets their fathers had walked, past the same terraced houses, the same corner shops, the same pubs with their painted names fading in the damp, past houses where the curtains still moved at the same hour each morning, because the hour was set not by alarm clocks, but by the accumulated habit of generations. The knowledge, bred into the bones of the district over 100 years, that the gates at Lethley Lane opened at a specific time, and that a man who was not there when they opened was a man who had, in some small but serious way, failed in his understanding of what life in Hunslet required of him. They had been walking these streets since 1860. The yard in those final weeks had the quality of a place that already knows it is becoming a memory. The foundry was still running, but not at anything approaching its historic capacity. The drawing office, once the largest and most technically accomplished in the West, writing the room where men had bent over specifications for soil types in Queensland and Argentina and Fiji, was largely empty. The desks remained, the drawing boards remained, the accumulated patina of decades of concentrated technical work remained, in the smell of the room if nothing else. The men who still came through the gates were, by now, a community of witnesses as much as a workforce. There was no single final day in the sense that drama requires, no morning on which a foreman gathered the remaining men in the yard and made a speech, no moment at which a furnace was ceremonially extinguished and a gate ceremonially locked. The end of the steam plough works came the way the end of most industrial things comes. Gradually, then completely, the productive activity tapering to nothing over weeks rather than stopping on a fixed date, until one morning the number of men with work to do reached 0, and the gates stayed closed, not because anyone had ordered them closed, but because there was no longer any reason to open them. But there were last things. There are always last things. The last engine to be completed at the Hunslet Works was a rail locomotive, narrow gauge, built to the specifications of an overseas customer whose plantation railway had been ordering from Leeds in one form or another for the better part of 50 years. The men who built it worked with the same precision they brought to every engine. The tolerances checked, the fittings inspected, the paintwork applied with the care of craftsmen who understood that the name on the firebox door was a statement of accountability as much as identity. It was, by any objective measure, an engine indistinguishable in quality from the engines that had rolled off this yard in 1913, when 3,000 men had filled these buildings, and the catalog had announced with serene confidence that demand was constantly increasing, that the works producing it now employed a fraction of those 3,000, that the buildings around them were largely silent, the furnaces largely cold, the drawing office largely empty, did not show in the engine itself. This is what craft means. In the end, not sentiment, not nostalgia. The refusal to allow the condition of the institution to express itself in the quality of the work. The men who signed off on that last engine signed off on it the same way they would have signed off on any other. Inspector's mark, date, works number. The same administrative notation that had been applied to every engine leaving this yard since the 1860s. A chain of documented accountability stretching back through 110 years of production to the first machines that John Fowler had overseen in person, standing in the yard with his coat dusted with iron filings, checking the tolerances himself because he did not yet have enough men to trust the checking to anyone else. The chain ended here. When the last engine was loaded and dispatched, the men who had built it did not stand around and mark the occasion. There was no collective acknowledgement of what the moment represented. No gathering in the yard, no shared silence. No ritual adequate to 110 years of continuous production. Most of them had known, in the particular way that experienced industrial workers know things that have not been officially announced, that this moment was approaching. They had absorbed that knowledge over months and done nothing with it because there was nothing to be done with it. The work was the work until it stopped being the work. And then it stopped. One by one, over the final days of production, the remaining men collected their tools, the personal tools that a craftsman carries from job to job throughout a working life, and left them in their lockers for the last time, or took them home in bags that they did not make a performance of carrying. The lockers were cleared. The tea urns went cold. The clocking-in machine received its last card and was not used again. Outside, Lethley Lane was unchanged. The terraced houses stood as they had always stood. The corner shops were open. The sky was the same January gray it had always been at this hour. Nothing in the street indicated that something irreversible had just occurred behind the gates of the works that the street had organized itself around for 100 years. There was no crowd. There was no press photographer. There was no civic acknowledgement of any kind. The gates at the steam Plough Works closed in the early weeks of 1974, and Hunslet went on without them. Because places always go on. Because the school run does not pause for industrial history, and the rent is due regardless of what has happened at the factory. But carrying, in the specific quiet of the streets around Lethley Lane, a kind of absence that had no name and required none. The people who lived there knew what it was. They had grown up knowing what it was. They simply had not, until now, been required to live inside it. Somewhere in a field on the far side of the world, in Queensland perhaps, or Brazil, a Fowler engine was still running. Dark green, brass fittings, the name of the company and the address of the works in raised lettering on the firebox door. Lethley Lane, Hunslet, Leeds. The address still existed. The building still stood. But the thing that had made the address mean something, the furnaces, the drawing office, the 3,000 men, the ambition of a Quaker from Wiltshire who had believed that a machine could carry what a body should not have to, that was gone. The furrow had been turned. The field was quiet. If you drive to Lethley Lane in Hunslet today, you will find a Costco. The car park is extensive. On a Saturday morning, families move through the aisles in the particular days of people confronted with abundance at scale, filling their trolleys with quantities of things that no previous generation would have had the means or the storage space to accumulate. Somewhere beneath the concrete of that car park, 9 acres of industrial ground, remember a different kind of scale entirely. The blue plaque is on a wall near the site entrance. It is the standard format, circular, ceramic, the kind of modest civic marker that Britain affixes to places where significant things happened and then moves on from. Having discharged its obligation to memory with a minimum of disruption to the surrounding architecture. It records that John Fowler and Company operated here from 1860, that John Fowler was the inventor of the steam plowing engine, that this site was the steam Plough Works. It is accurate. It is brief. Most people who park their cars beneath it do not read it. This is not a criticism. It is simply what happens when the present occupies the ground that the past once held. The past recedes to the margins, to the edge of the car park, to the small round disc on the wall that most people walk past because they are thinking about what they came for and not about what was here before they arrived. The past does not demand attention. It waits quietly for the people who are looking for it. The people who are looking for it tend, in the case of Fowler, to be steam enthusiasts. Approximately 700 Fowler engines have survived into preservation. A figure that is, when you consider that the company produced machines for over a century and that most heavy industrial equipment ends its working life as scrap, genuinely remarkable. They exist on multiple continents, in various states of restoration, in the collections of private enthusiasts and traction engine clubs, and rural museums whose members spend their weekends doing something that has no obvious economic rationale and an extremely powerful hold on the people who do it, keeping old machines alive. At the Pickering Traction Engine Rally in North Yorkshire, a pair of Fowler plowing engines are demonstrated annually, working in concert in the way that Fowler intended. One at each headland, the cable running between them, the balanced plow moving back and forth across the field in the rhythm that John Fowler had first established in a Bristol experiment in 1850. The engines are maintained to a standard of mechanical precision that their original operators would recognize and respect. They carry the name of the works on their firebox doors. They are, in the most literal possible sense, the last living evidence of what happened on Lethley Lane. In Reading at the Museum of English Rural Life, the John Fowler and Company archive occupies a significant portion of the collections. Production registers, drawing office records, photograph albums, administrative files covering the period from 1850 to 1971, a span of documentation so comprehensive that researchers can, with patience and the right index, trace the journey of a specific engine from its date of production through its works number, its order reference, its purchaser, and its delivery date. 43 volumes of production registers and photograph albums were conserved in 2019 with funding from Arts Council England, the Steam Plough Club, and a private donation, their bindings repaired, their pages stabilized, their contents made accessible to researchers who would otherwise have been unable to handle them without causing further damage. The volume of material is, in its way, a form of institutional conscience. The accumulated record of a company that built things carefully and documented them completely because precision in the paperwork was understood as an extension of precision in the engineering. Every engine that left the yard at Lethley Lane is in those registers. The Egyptian cotton estate engines, the Queensland sugar plantation engines, the narrow-gauge locomotives for the coffee fazendas of Brazil. What the registers cannot tell you is what happened to the men. Not the name ones, not Fowler, not Eighth, not Gregg, whose deaths are recorded in the historical literature with varying degrees of biographical attention. The men who worked the yard, the men who tended the furnaces and operated the foundry and carried the finished components from one workshop to the next and signed the inspector's mark on engines destined for fields they would never see. Their names are in the wage books, which are also in the archive, but wage books record transactions rather than lives, and the distance between the two is considerable. Some of their grandchildren still live in Hunslet. They will tell you, if you ask, that their grandfather worked at Fowler's. They will say it with the particular inflection of people whose connection to an institution has survived the institution itself. A pride that has become slightly abstract over the decades because the thing that gave rise to the pride is no longer there to point at, but that persists regardless. Because pride of that kind does not require a living referent. It requires only the knowledge that the work was real and that it mattered, and that the name on the plaque on the wall of the car park is the name that was on the pay packet every Friday for the better part of a working life. The engines endure in the way that metal endures, slowly, with maintenance and attention, subject to the same entropy as everything else, but resistant to it in proportion to the care that is applied. The men endure in the way that people endure, in the children who carry their faces and the stories that get shorter with each generation until they are reduced, eventually, to a name and an occupation and the knowledge that there was something worth remembering, even if the details have been lost. The blue plaque endures in the way that plaques endure, without feeling anything about it. And the Costco car park endures in the way that car parks endure, which is to say efficiently and without complexity, fulfilling its purpose with a thoroughness that the steam Plough Works would, in its better moments, have recognized as a form of professional competence. It is not, however, the same thing. John Fowler never wrote a manifesto. He left behind patents, correspondence, business records, and the physical evidence of a factory that outlasted him by a century. He left behind a hiring scheme designed to make his technology accessible to people who could not afford to own it, and a cost-per-acre calculation that treated economic fairness as an engineering problem, solvable if you applied sufficient rigor to the numbers. He left behind a company built on the conviction that a machine could carry what a body should not have to, and that this transfer of burden from the human to the mechanical was, in itself, a moral act. He did not leave behind instructions for what to do when the machine ended up somewhere he had not intended. This is the difficulty at the center of the Fowler story. Not the difficulty of villainy, because the story contains no satisfying villain, but the difficulty of consequence. The difficulty of tracing the distance between an intention and its outcome across a supply chain, a shipping manifest, a colonial railway, and a plantation economy that used the language of modernization to perform, in many cases, a more efficient version of what it had always been doing. Fowler intended liberation. The machine delivered productivity. These are not the same thing, and the gap between them is not a gap that anyone at Lethley Lane chose to measure. It would be convenient if this were unusual. It is not. The history of industrial technology is substantially the history of tools designed for one purpose being deployed for another, and of the men who designed the tools declining, in most cases, to follow them far enough into the world to see what they were actually being used for. The steam engine that powered the mill also powered the mine. The railway that connected the city also carried the troops. The plowing engine that freed the Yorkshire tenant farmer from the tyranny of clay soil also turned the red earth of 5 continents under conditions that the Royal Agricultural Society's judges, writing their reports in comfortable rooms in London, had no particular occasion to consider. None of this exonerates anyone, but it distributes the weight differently than a simple moral verdict would allow. Fowler's machines are still working. At rallies across Britain and Australia and elsewhere, pairs of plowing engines demonstrate the double-engine cable system that John Fowler patented in the 1850s, working the same rhythm across the same kind of heavy soil that the technology was designed to address. They are functioning historical arguments, proof that the idea worked, that the engineering was sound, that the machine Fowler spent his life building was, on its own terms, everything he said it would be. What the rallies do not demonstrate, because demonstrations are bounded events with defined fields and controlled conditions, is the full range of what those machines were asked to do in the century of their working lives. The plantation fields are not represented. The colonial shipping manifests are not displayed. The wage books of the indentured workers who operated Fowler engines on Queensland sugar estates in the 1880s are not, so far as is known, preserved in any archive that researchers currently visit. The record is incomplete in the places where the story is hardest. This is not unusual either. Industrial archives document production and profit with considerable thoroughness. They document the human conditions of production with considerably less. The men who built the engines are in the wage books. The men who operated them in the fields of distant continents are, in the main, nowhere. Present only as the implied labor force behind an export order, visible only in the soil disturbance that the engine's cable left behind, which is to say not visible at all. What remains then is the question, not the question of guilt. That frame is too narrow for what actually happened, and too easily deflects attention from the systemic to the individual, from the economic structure to the personal failing. The question is larger and less comfortable than guilt allows. It is the question of what we owe to the consequences of our intentions, of how far a maker is responsible for what is made of what he makes, of whether a machine can carry a conscience, or whether conscience is precisely the thing that machines cannot carry. The weight that remains always with the person who built the machine and chose not to follow it far enough into the world to see where it went. John Fowler followed his machines as far as he could. He followed them into exhibitions and trials and demonstrations across England, arguing the case for steam cultivation with the energy of a man who believed that an idea, correctly expressed, could change the world. He followed them into the Yorkshire fields of tenant farmers who could not previously have afforded to plough efficiently, and watched the calculation work out in their favor, and went home satisfied that the machine was doing what he had designed it to do. He died before the machines reached Queensland. He died before the shipping agents in Liverpool were routing export orders to plantation managers whose labor conditions he would have found, had he encountered them directly, irreconcilable with every principle his community had spent 2 centuries articulating. Perhaps the most honest thing that can be said is that the gap between what Fowler intended and what his machines were used for is not a gap that any individual could have closed alone, and that the system which opened that gap was larger than any factory, any founder, any blue plaque on any wall. But the question does not close because the answer is difficult. It remains open in the way that genuine questions remain open, not from a failure of intelligence or will, but because the world that produced it is still, in its essential structure, the world we inhabit. The tools we build still travel further than we follow them. The consequences of our intentions still outrun our knowledge of them. Somewhere in a field, in Queensland perhaps, or Brazil, or on the red soil of a continent that the men of Lethley Lane knew only from the shipping address on an order form, a Fowler engine turned the earth for the last time and was retired. Dark green, brass fittings polished. The name of the works in raised lettering on the firebox door. Lethley Lane, Hunslet, Leeds. The address that is now a car park. The works that is now a plaque. The question that is now, and perhaps always was, the only thing the factory ever built that has not yet been resolved.